Good evening. I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Welcome to Truth Report. Tonight, we're covering a story that should terrify every American, regardless of where you stand on immigration. Because this isn't about immigration anymore. This is about federal agents killing American citizens in American streets, and a governor telling a president to get his forces out of a state before more people die.
2 people shot dead in Minneapolis in 3 weeks. Both American citizens. Neither one a target of immigration enforcement. One was a mother of 3. The other was an ICU nurse who appears to have been holding a phone when federal agents fired at least 10 rounds into him. And the administration's response? Self-defense.
But we also have something else tonight, something that might actually represent hope. Because while federal forces were killing civilians, the people of Minneapolis organized one of the largest general strikes in modern American history. Over 700 businesses closed. Tens of thousands marched in -20-degree weather. They barricaded a detention center and shut down operations at one of the country's busiest airports.
We're going to walk through exactly what happened, who the victims were, what the video evidence actually shows, and why Minnesota's Democratic governor is now in open confrontation with the White House. Then we'll talk about whether the Minnesota model, combining labor strikes, mutual aid networks, and direct action, can actually stop what's happening. Let's start with the victims.
Renee Nicole Good. 37 years old. Mother of 3 children. U.S. citizen. Shot and killed by an immigration and customs enforcement officer on January 4, 2026, in Minneapolis. According to the Intercept's reporting, she wasn't a target of immigration enforcement. She was just there.
3 weeks later, on January 24, federal agents kill Alex Jeffrey Preddy. Also 37 years old. ICU nurse with a valid Minnesota nursing license issued in 2021. Also a U.S. citizen. Also not a target of immigration enforcement. According to eyewitnesses who spoke to The Intercept, he appeared to be observing a federal operation when agents confronted him.
Let's be extremely clear about what the evidence shows, because the federal government's narrative falls apart under the slightest scrutiny. The Department of Homeland Security claims Preddy was armed and violently resisted, forcing agents to fire in self-defense. But Bellingcat, the open-source investigative outlet, analyzed multiple videos from the scene.
And here's what Bellingcat found. The videos appear to show agents taking a gun from Preddy before the first shot was fired. Not during. Not after. Before. Meaning he was disarmed when they started shooting. The footage shows Preddy holding a phone, not a weapon, and shielding himself from pepper spray as agents closed in.
Bellingcat documented at least 10 total shots. Most were fired after Preddy was already on the ground, motionless. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey reviewed the footage and described what he saw: more than 6 masked federal agents pummeling one of our constituents, shooting him to death. Police Chief Brian O'Hara confirmed that Preddy's only interactions with law enforcement were traffic tickets. He was a lawful gun owner with a permit to carry.
One eyewitness told The Intercept that federal agents initially appeared to be preparing to leave. Then they started pushing him and another observer across the street. About 3 minutes later, the witness heard a series of gunshots in rapid succession. Another witness confirmed Preddy appeared to be an observer rather than someone agents were targeting.
So let's name what this is. This is an extrajudicial killing of a U.S. citizen by federal agents who then lied about the circumstances. And it happened in broad daylight, on video, 3 weeks after the same federal apparatus killed another U.S. citizen in the same city.
Minnesota Governor Tim Walz held a news conference on Sunday, the day after Preddy was killed. Walz is a Democrat, a former teacher and National Guard veteran, and he did something remarkable. He directly challenged the President of the United States by name and demanded federal forces leave his state.
Here's what Walz said, and I want you to hear the exact words. What's the plan, Donald Trump? What is the plan? He called for the removal of what he characterized as 3,000 untrained agents before additional deaths occur. He called the shooting horrific and said the federal government cannot be trusted to lead this investigation.
That last point is crucial. Walz is asserting state authority to investigate federal agents for killing state residents. That's not a small thing. That's a governor telling a president, your people committed what appears to be murder in my state, and I don't trust you to investigate yourselves, so we're doing it.
Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey went even further. He said Minneapolis is being invaded by its own federal government. Representative Ilhan Omar, who represents Minneapolis, called Preddy's death an execution. These aren't fringe activists. These are elected officials watching federal agents kill their constituents and saying, out loud, that this is illegitimate state violence.
Now let's talk about the Trump administration's response, because it reveals exactly how they plan to handle this. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche was asked about the video evidence contradicting the self-defense claims. His response: I do not know. And nobody else knows, either. That's why we're doing an investigation.
Which is a fascinating answer, because we do know. We have video. Bellingcat analyzed it. Eyewitnesses described it. The mayor watched it. The police chief confirmed Pretty wasn't a criminal. What we're seeing is the administration deploying a classic strategy: acknowledge that an investigation is needed, but refuse to acknowledge what the evidence already shows, and certainly don't change anything about the operations that led to the killing.
Because here's the thing, between December 2025 and late January 2026, federal immigration authorities detained over 2,000 people in Minnesota. Most were deported through Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. This isn't a targeted operation going after specific individuals. This is a mass deportation machine that has now killed 2 bystanders in 3 weeks.
And that brings us to January 23, the day before Alex Pretty was killed. Because while federal forces were ramping up operations, something else was happening in Minneapolis. The people organized a general strike on a scale we haven't seen in this country in decades.
Over 700 businesses shut down for the day. Tens of thousands of people marched through downtown Minneapolis in minus 20-degree weather. Let me repeat that, minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and people still turned out in massive numbers because they'd watched federal agents kill Renee Good 3 weeks earlier and they knew more violence was coming.
The strike was coordinated by an unprecedented coalition: all major labor unions in the city, religious institutions, community organizations, and frontline activists. Kieran Knutson, president of Communications Workers of America Local 7250, said something that should become a slogan for this moment: nothing runs without the working class in this country.
Protesters barricaded the Whipple Detention Center for 2 hours, physically blocking federal authorities from operating. More than 1,000 people picketed Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, where deportation flights have been leaving daily. About 100 people were arrested at the airport action. They shut down normal operations at one of the busiest airports in the country.
And this wasn't spontaneous. According to the Intercept's reporting, organizers built on infrastructure that was developed during the 2020 George Floyd uprising in Minneapolis. They created networks that combine 3 elements: strike action to halt economic activity, neighborhood patrols to protect vulnerable communities, and mutual aid to provide transportation and care for immigrants.
That structure is important, because it means this isn't just a protest that happens for a day and then dissipates. They've built durable organizations capable of sustained resistance. And the timing tells you everything. They organized this massive strike on January 23, and federal agents killed someone the very next day. The government's response to mass mobilization was to kill another civilian.
Now I want to connect this to a broader pattern, because Minnesota is not unique. What we're seeing is the Trump administration deploying what it characterizes as immigration enforcement, but what functions in practice as an occupying force in Democratic-controlled cities. Federal agents who aren't accountable to local authorities, who operate in masks without identification, who kill civilians and claim self-defense.
And when local officials push back, when a governor demands answers, when a mayor calls it an invasion, when a congresswoman calls it an execution, the federal response is to continue operations unchanged and to control the investigation into their own agents' conduct. This is a constitutional crisis happening in real time, and most media outlets are covering it as if it's just another immigration story.
It's not an immigration story anymore. Neither victim was an immigrant. Neither was targeted for enforcement. Federal agents killed 2 U.S. citizens who were simply present when operations were happening. If that can happen to them, it can happen to anyone who observes, anyone who protests, anyone who films federal agents operating in their neighborhood.
Let's talk about who benefits from this. Because this level of violence isn't accidental. It serves a purpose. When you kill people for observing federal operations, you're sending a message to everyone else: don't watch, don't film, don't bear witness. The violence creates a chilling effect.
And when you flood a city with thousands of agents conducting mass raids, you create economic disruption. Immigrants stop going to work. Families keep kids home from school. People avoid hospitals, avoid reporting crimes, avoid any interaction with authorities. The social fabric starts to break down, which then becomes justification for even more federal intervention.
This is also a direct attack on labor organizing. Minnesota has strong unions and a history of labor militancy. When you round up thousands of workers, regardless of their documentation status, you're not just enforcing immigration law. You're breaking unions, suppressing wages, and making it harder for workers to organize for better conditions.
The private prison industry benefits enormously. The Whipple Detention Center that protesters barricaded is part of a multi-billion-dollar system that profits from detention. More arrests mean more contracts, more facilities, more public money flowing into private hands. Follow the money.
And politically, this serves the administration's interests by creating a confrontation with Democratic governors and mayors. When Governor Walz demands federal agents leave Minnesota, the administration can frame that as Democrats protecting criminals, even though the agents are killing U.S. citizens. It's a manufactured crisis designed to produce political conflict.
But here's what should worry everyone paying attention. The federal government now has precedent for deploying masked agents to conduct operations in American cities over the objection of local officials, and when those agents kill civilians, they claim self-defense and investigate themselves. If you think that power will only be used for immigration enforcement, you're not paying attention to history.
Because once you establish that federal agents can operate in Minneapolis this way, they can operate anywhere this way. Once you establish that killing observers is justified as self-defense, you've criminalized witnessing. Once you establish that the federal government can override state authority and refuse state investigations, you've eliminated one of the key checks on federal power.
And that's why the Minnesota general strike matters so much. Because it showed that there is a way to fight back, and it's not through electoral politics or lawsuits or appeals to federal authorities who clearly don't care. It's through collective action that physically disrupts the machinery of deportation.
700 businesses closing for a day means economic leverage. Barricading a detention center means operations stop. Shutting down airport operations means deportation flights can't leave. These are material interventions that actually prevent harm in the immediate term, rather than symbolic protests that just make people feel better.
The Intercept's reporting on this strike is titled "We Can Fight This, Minnesota's General Strike Shows How." And the core argument is that only a future of general strikes involving large-scale disruptions has the chance of stopping Trump's forces. I want to sit with that for a moment, because it's a radical claim.
What they're saying is that normal political channels have failed. Elections haven't stopped this. Courts haven't stopped this. Congressional oversight hasn't stopped this. Local officials are openly saying they can't trust federal authorities. So what's left? Direct action. Strikes. Physical disruption of operations. Mutual aid networks that bypass government systems entirely.
And we should acknowledge that this is risky. 100 people were arrested at the airport. Protesters who barricaded the detention center could face serious charges. People who participate in strikes might lose jobs. Federal agents have shown they're willing to use lethal force against civilians. This isn't costless resistance.
But the alternative is to watch the deportation machine expand, watch more people get detained, watch federal agents consolidate power in American cities, and hope that eventually someone in authority will stop it. And the evidence suggests that's not going to happen. 2 civilians are dead. The operations continue. The administration's position is unchanged.
So let's talk about replication. Can the Minnesota model work elsewhere? What would it take to organize general strikes in other cities where federal immigration enforcement is ramping up? What are the obstacles?
First obstacle is coordination. Minnesota's strike worked because unions, religious groups, and community organizations had already built relationships during the George Floyd uprising. They had infrastructure. They had trust. They had communication channels. Most cities don't have that level of organization ready to activate.
Second obstacle is economic vulnerability. When you ask workers to strike, you're asking them to risk their income, potentially their jobs. In a strong union town like Minneapolis, there's more protection. In right-to-work states with weak labor power, it's much harder to get workers to take that risk, especially if they're living paycheck to paycheck.
Third obstacle is state repression. We saw 100 arrests at the airport, and that's with a Democratic governor who's sympathetic to the cause. Imagine trying to organize this in a state where the governor fully supports Trump's immigration agenda. You'd see mass arrests, probably felony charges, maybe federal conspiracy charges against organizers.
But none of those obstacles are insurmountable. What Minnesota showed is that it's possible. And sometimes that's the most important thing, proof of concept. The question now is whether other cities can learn from this, adapt it to their conditions, and build their own capacity for sustained resistance.
Because sustained is the key word. One strike is powerful symbolically, but the deportation machine can wait it out. What would really matter is repeated strikes, escalating disruption, sustained economic pressure that makes it impossible for federal operations to continue as planned. That requires resources, organization, and commitment that goes beyond what most protest movements achieve.
It also requires solidarity from people who aren't directly affected. Federal agents aren't kicking down doors in wealthy white suburbs. They're targeting specific communities. For a general strike to work, you need workers across industries and demographics willing to strike in solidarity with immigrants they may never meet. That's a heavy lift.
But it's happened before in American history. There are precedents for general strikes, for labor solidarity across racial and ethnic lines, for sustained campaigns that actually won. The 1930s labor movement. The civil rights movement. The coalition of Immokalee workers. These things are possible when people decide the cost of inaction is higher than the cost of resistance.
Let's bring this back to the immediate situation in Minnesota. What happens next? Governor Walz has demanded federal agents leave. Trump has shown no indication he'll comply. 2 people are dead. Thousands of Minnesotans have been detained. Where does this go?
Legally, it's complicated. States don't have the authority to expel federal agents. The Supremacy Clause of the Constitution means federal law generally overrides state law. But states do have authority to investigate crimes committed within their borders, even by federal agents. So Walz could order a state investigation, potentially leading to state criminal charges.
Which would then raise the question of whether federal agents could be prosecuted in state court for actions taken during federal operations. There's not a lot of precedent for that. The federal government would almost certainly argue that agents have immunity. You'd end up with a court battle that could go to the Supreme Court.
Meanwhile, the operations continue. That's the thing, all of this legal and political maneuvering happens on a timeline of months or years, while deportations happen daily. The detention center operates every day. The airport processes deportation flights every day. Federal agents conduct raids every day. The law is too slow to stop immediate harm.
Which brings us back to the strike model. Because the strike happens immediately. Businesses close today, the airport shuts down today, the detention center gets barricaded today. It operates on the timeline of harm rather than the timeline of legal process. That's a fundamental strategic difference.
And it's worth noting that the federal government has historically been much more responsive to economic disruption than to legal challenges. When workers strike and supply chains break and businesses lose money, suddenly there's pressure to negotiate. Federal judges can rule against the government, and the government can just ignore them. But the government can't ignore an economy that stops functioning.
The civil rights movement understood this. The Montgomery bus boycott worked because it hurt the bus company financially. The lunch counter sit-ins worked because they disrupted business. The March on Washington was timed to create maximum political pressure on Congress. Direct action gets results when it creates costs for the powerful.
So if we're thinking about what comes next, the question is whether Minnesota can sustain this level of mobilization, and whether other cities can build their own capacity to do the same thing. Because one strike in one city is impressive, but it's not enough to fundamentally change the balance of power. You need coordination across multiple cities, sustained over time.
You also need to protect the people on the front lines. 100 people arrested at the airport probably face charges. They need legal defense, they need bail funds, they need support while they're fighting cases. The infrastructure of sustained resistance includes mutual aid for the resistors themselves.
And there's a moral dimension here that I want to name explicitly. Alex Preddy was an ICU nurse. His job was to care for people in crisis. He died watching federal agents operate in his neighborhood. Renee Good was a mother of 3. They weren't activists or organizers, they were just people living their lives who ended up in the wrong place when federal agents decided to use lethal force.
Which means the rest of us have a responsibility to care about this, even if we're not personally at risk. Even if we're citizens, even if we're documented, even if we're white, even if we live in suburbs where ICE never conducts raids. Because the precedent being set here is that federal agents can kill civilians without accountability, and that precedent doesn't stay confined to immigration enforcement.
History shows that powers claimed for one purpose inevitably get used for others. The surveillance state built to fight terrorism got turned on Black Lives Matter protesters. The police militarization justified for drug enforcement got used to suppress labor organizing. The tools of repression, once created, get used wherever resistance appears.
So when we watch thousands of federal agents operating in Minneapolis, when we watch them kill civilians, when we watch a governor openly challenge a president and demand their removal, we're not just watching an immigration story. We're watching the architecture of authoritarianism being built in real time, and the question is whether we're going to accept it or fight it.
Minnesota said they're going to fight it. 700 businesses, tens of thousands of people in minus 20-degree weather, barricading detention centers, shutting down airports. That's what resistance looks like when people decide the cost of compliance is too high. And the day after that massive strike, federal agents killed someone else.
Which tells you how scared they are of this model. Because if general strikes can stop deportations in Minneapolis, they can stop deportations anywhere. If workers can shut down airports, they can shut down ICE operations entirely. If communities can make federal enforcement too costly and difficult to sustain, the whole policy collapses. The violence is a response to that threat.
So we're at an inflection point. The Trump administration has shown it's willing to kill civilians and lie about it. Minnesota has shown there's a way to fight back through collective action. The question is whether that fight spreads and intensifies, or whether it gets isolated and crushed. And that depends on what people do in the next few weeks.
If you're watching this and wondering what you can do, here's what organizers would tell you: build local capacity now. Connect with unions, faith groups, community organizations. Create rapid response networks. Plan what a general strike would look like in your city. Because by the time you desperately need these structures, it's too late to build them.
And document everything. Film every federal operation you witness. Upload it immediately. The only reason we know Alex Preddy was murdered is because people filmed it and Bellingcat analyzed the footage. The federal government will lie. Video evidence can contradict those lies, but only if people are willing to bear witness even when it's dangerous.
Which brings us to the question of media responsibility, including our own. How do we cover this? Most outlets are still using the administration's framing, calling these immigration enforcement operations, referring to agents' claims of self-defense, treating this like a policy debate rather than a crisis of state violence.
We have to call it what it is. Federal agents killed 2 U.S. citizens who weren't targets of enforcement. That's not immigration policy. That's extrajudicial killing. When agents claim self-defense and video evidence contradicts them, we have to say they're lying. When thousands of agents occupy a city over the objection of local officials, we have to call it occupation.
Because the language shapes how people understand what's happening. If this is just immigration enforcement, then it's a policy question people can agree to disagree about. But if this is federal agents killing civilians and lying about it, that's a crisis that demands immediate action. The facts support the second framing, not the first.
And we have to cover resistance as seriously as we cover government action. The Minnesota general strike is one of the most significant labor actions in recent American history. It deserves the same level of analysis and attention as a presidential speech or a congressional hearing. Maybe more, because it represents actual power being exercised by working people.
The Intercept's reporting on this has been essential. They went to Minneapolis, talked to eyewitnesses, analyzed video, connected the killing to the broader pattern of federal operations. That's investigative journalism doing what it's supposed to do, holding power accountable and giving voice to people resisting that power. We need more of that, not less.
As we wrap up tonight, I want to come back to Renee Good and Alex Preddy. 37 years old. Both of them. A mother and a nurse. Killed 3 weeks apart in the same city by federal agents who claimed self-defense despite evidence to the contrary. They deserve to live. Their families deserve justice. And the rest of us deserve a government that doesn't kill civilians and then lie about it.
Minnesota is showing us that resistance is possible. But it requires courage, organization, solidarity, and sustained commitment. It requires people willing to risk arrest, willing to strike even when it's costly, willing to physically disrupt the machinery of deportation. And it requires the rest of us to support them, to amplify their actions, to build similar capacity in our own communities.
Governor Walz asked President Trump a question: what's the plan? We can ask ourselves the same question. What's our plan? Are we going to watch this happen and hope someone in authority stops it? Or are we going to organize, strike, resist, and build the power to stop it ourselves? Minnesota has answered that question. Now the rest of us have to answer it too.
That's Truth Report for tonight. I'm Maya Clarity.
And I'm Alex Truth. Stay informed. Stay organized. Stay safe.